Hi everybody, and thanks for coming along today. I'm going to describe an experiment that was conducted by Ronnie as part of his honours thesis a few years ago under my supervision, looking at sensitivity to punishment and the effects of negative feedback of an academic kind. We acknowledge the people of the Gambanga and Bundjalung nations who own the land on which we live and work, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I think the first thing to say is that I think feedback is tricky. This became apparent to me when I was a tutor a very long time ago at the Australian National University, and one of my students came and asked me if they could talk to me about what I had written on their essay. And I thought, that's good, they're interested and engaged, and I'll be able to give them some further advice about how it is that they might improve their writing or something like that. When the student arrived in my office, it was clear that he was completely livid. He was enraged by the feedback that I had written on his essay, which had not been intended on my part to be so cruel and horrible, but which he thought was an indication of what an arrogant and very unpleasant person I was. And he proceeded to lay that out for me and to back it up with the conversations that he had had with other students who basically all felt the same way about me as a consequence of getting their feedback on their essay. So since then I've been fairly conservative in the way that I have dished out feedback, and that may be good or it may be not so good. It probably means that in some instances where I could have given sounder advice about what students might find useful, I've probably moved away from that and resisted the temptation to put feedback on most things if I can avoid it in any case. So my personal experience is that feedback is a little bit tricky, and in order to avoid becoming known to be unpleasant, I've kind of adopted a particular style with respect to feedback, which is not necessarily the best plan. I didn't do anything about that for some period of time because I couldn't really see what it is that I could do about it particularly. But when Ronnie started talking to me about what he was interested in for his honours thesis, it became apparent that there might be an opportunity to do some scholarship of teaching and learning around the nature of feedback and around the different sorts of individual responses to feedback. Ronnie was at that time working in the university section that was dealing with student feedback to the university, and so he was familiar with how it is that the university system worked and how it is that the learning systems within the university worked. He had good access to lots of colleagues who could give him advice that they'd gained through being engaged in assisting students with challenges to learning, and he was very interested in how it is that individual differences might play out in terms of feedback. So we started from the idea that I'd been doing a bit of work on the BIS-BAS. The idea that there are two basic kind of factors that are involved in people's temperamental response to reinforcement and feedback is pretty old. But the most recent version of this is based upon Gray's kind of account of sensitivity to reward and punishment. And Gray posits that there are two basic systems involved in the response to reward and punishment, which he calls the behavioural approach system, or BAS, and the behavioural inhibition system, called BIS. And a lot of the literature now is arranged around trying to investigate BIS-BAS systems and how it is that they play out in terms of modifying behaviour when reinforcers or punishers are present. In order to measure the BIS-BAS, there's a variety of techniques. The Carver and White survey instrument is the one that's probably best known. But more recently, Kaur and Cooper proposed a reinforcement sensitivity theory of personality questionnaire, RSTPQ, which generally speaking has better sorts of psychometric properties than the Carver and White instrument does, and which we actually employed in our study. In measuring the BIS-VAS with this instrument, you answer questions, or you respond to items on a 4-point Likert scale as to how accurately each of the statements in that instrument reflects your everyday feelings and behaviours, from not at all to highly. And an example of one of the BAS items from the instrument is sometimes even little things in life can give me great pleasure. An example of one of the BIS items is I feel sad when I suffer even minor setbacks. So by answering a series of these kinds of items, it's proposed that you're able to assess the person's responsiveness to punishment and to reinforcement, reflecting the operation of the BIS and the BAS respectively. So we utilised this instrument in our study, and we were looking for ways in which we could actually measure responses to feedback in order to see how it is that that might interact with with sensitivity to punishment and reinforcement. The original idea was to actually construct a series of statements that reflected the kind of reinforcement that you might get for an essay, the kind of feedback you might get for an essay, and to use eye tracking in order to determine people's responsiveness to those text feedback. That wasn't possible for us to do, so we adopted a procedure which was described, approximately described by Fox, Russo and Dutton some time ago, in which they had used for assessing attentional bias to threat. In their study, they presented a Q, which was related to, in their case, anxiety and a threat. And they looked at people who were relatively high in anxiousness versus people who were relatively low in anxiousness. The cues that they presented were either angry, happy or neutral faces, and the way that it was arranged was such that those angry, happy or neutral faces would precede the presentation of a target on the screen to which participants had to respond to, and when the target on the screen was on the same side of the screen as the cue, people's response times, they were referred to as valid trials, and people's response times were shorter than on the invalid trials when the face was, when the cue was presented on the opposite side of the screen to the target. So we employed something very like this. We had a queuing task on which the participants initially started by viewing a fixation point on the center of the computer screen. They were then presented with two pieces of text. One piece of text was either a negative or positive example of feedback, which I'll describe in a second, and the other piece of text was something that was relatively neutral. Following the presentation of one of those two pieces of text, a target would appear either behind the negative or positive feedback example or on the opposite side of the screen to the negative or positive feedback example. So on a negative valid trial, the target would appear on the screen on the same side as the negative feedback example had occurred. That would be described as a valid trial because it's on the same side, and it's a negative valid trial because it was negative feedback that was presented on the screen. The participants' task was to identify whether or not the target was either a cross or an X on the screen. So they had to actually identify it, not just say which side of the screen it was being presented on. We had a total of 164 trials, with 78% of them being valid trials in which the cue and the feedback, the target and the feedback were on the same side, and 22% of the trials were invalid. The text was presented for 3,000 milliseconds, not 300 as the slide says, and as I said, they had to indicate whether or not the target was a cross or a plus sign. If reaction times for valid trials are shorter than invalid trials, then it would appear to be the case that the text is holding the participants' attention. and that was what we were expecting to see, I guess, on the basis of Fox and Russo's kind of work. But the opposite might occur, in which you might see a shorter reaction time on the invalid trials, and that would indicate perhaps that the participants were avoiding the feedback text rather than ruminating on it or holding their attention. The feedback text consisted of 10 items which Ronnie created in collaboration with people from the Teaching and Learning Centre at the university. Neutral sorts of feedback were things like, this week is a time to reflect and consolidate on your learning. Positive sorts of feedback were things like, your introduction addresses the criteria nicely. And negative feedback were things like, you need to improve your paraphrasing so you're not at risk of plagiarism. There were 10 of each of those that were presented randomly on random sides of the screen to participants over the trials. Our participants were 32 adults with a mean age of 38. All of them had engaged in tertiary study of some kind, and 60% of them were current university students. Of the group, 63% identified as female and 37% identified as male. All participants had normal or corrected to normal vision, and the research was approved by Southern Cross University Research Ethics Committee. And he conducted the study by lugging a laptop around. It was programmed in ePrime, and he ran the study in places that were convenient to both him and his participants around the university and other places. For the results, there was no effect of gender or age, and no effects overall for the mean of the 4 conditions. You can see the 4 conditions here. We used the average of the median responses because these reaction times are skewed, and you can see quite clearly that there's very little difference in the mean for each of the 4 conditions, which are the negative, invalid, negative, valid, positive, invalid, and positive, invalid and positive, valid. But that wasn't really what the interest was in any case. What we're interested in is whether or not there's an interaction between people's scores on sensitivity to reinforcement and punishment and the kind of reinforcement, the kind of feedback that they were getting. So we created a score which was the difference between the valid and the invalid trials on with negative text, and the difference between the valid and invalid trials with positive text, and we correlated that with scores on the behavioural inhibition system and behavioural activation system. And what you can see is that there's very little going on except for this relationship here. There's a correlation between the effect of validity for the negative text and the size of the score on the BIS scale. If we look a little bit more closely at this, this is the y-axis shows the difference between the valid and invalid reaction times for the negative feedback. And if that is a positive score, then it means they're attending more to the negative feedback. And if it's a negative score, it means they're attending more to the neutral feedback. And you can see that there's this correlation between BIS and the size of that difference appears to be that those people with a higher BIS score tend to be attending to the negative feedback more than those people with a low BIS score. So to summarise, we found evidence suggesting that sensitivity to reinforcement is related to students' response to negative feedback. The size of that effect is relatively small, but this wasn't a genuine assessment task in which feedback has personal relevance. And the nature of the negative feedback wasn't really very extreme. It was what most academics, I think, would regard to be relatively mild. That suggests that some of our students, at least, may be responding to well-intentioned feedback in a manner that isn't really optimal. And it leads to questions about what it is that you could do to maybe address this. One of the things I'm very interested in is stimulus equivalence, and I'm wondering whether or not you could design a stimulus equivalence task that would perhaps assist students to overcome the effect of the negative feedback that they're receiving on their written work. And that's about it from me. So thank you very much for your interest. and I hope to have a pleasant discussion at the time that this is presented. Bye-bye.